Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We are reading Among the Impostors, and we are on page 40. So, where we left off, Luke noticed that there was a door that was open, and he went out of it. He's also realized that the building he is in has no windows. It's just brick, straight, all the way up. And he's also noticed he thought someone knew he was out there, but the wind is just what's pushing this door open and close. So, what will we find? And will he finally read that note? So, there were no windows in any direction part of the wall. It was solid brick, up and down. How could that be? Luke thought about all the rooms he'd been in since coming to Hendrix, and it was true. He couldn't remember a single window in any of them. Even in the room he shared with Jackaboy and his minions was windowless. Why hadn't he ever noticed? And why would someone build so many windowless rooms? Suddenly, Luke didn't care. There were no windows. Nobody was coming to the door. He was safe. I can read the note now, he said aloud, and chuckled. It was strangely thrilling to hear his own voice. Not timid, not stammering. Luke's voice, not the pretend Lee's. I'm going to read it right over there, he said, speaking just for the pleasure of it. Finally. He strolled deeper into the woods and sat down on the very log he'd tripped over before. Slowly, ceremoniously, he slipped the note from Jen's dad out of his pocket. Now he'd know everything he needed to know. He unfolded a note which had grown worn from all the times he had palmed it, secretly transferring it from one pair of pants to the other, and then he stared, trying to make sense of Mr. Talbot's scrawl. The note held 2 words. Blend in. Chapter 8. No! Luke screamed. That was it? Blend in? What kind of advice was that? Luke needed help. He had been waiting weeks. I was counting on you, Luke screamed again, past caring who might hear. The B in blend blurred before his eyes. Desperately, he turned the note over, hoping there was more on the other side. The real message, maybe, but the other side was blank, and what he held was just a small, ragged scrap of paper, not much more than lint. Even Mother, who had saved everything, who reused envelopes, even when she wouldn't think twice about tossing this useless shred in the trash. And this tiny piece of nothing was what Luke had pinned all of his hopes on. Too furious to see straight, Luke ripped the note in half, in fourths, in eighths. He kept ripping it until the pieces of the paper were all but dust, practically microscopic. Then he threw them as far as he could. I hate you, Mr. Talbot, Luke yelled. The words echoed in the trees. Even the woods seemed to be making fun of him. That was probably all Mr. Talbot had meant to do. When he handed Luke the note the first day, Luke could just imagine Mr. Talbot chuckling as he drove away from Hendrix after leaving Luke. He probably thought it was funny to drop off a dumb farm boy at a snobby barren school and tell him, blend in. He probably laughed about it all the time. If Jen were still alive, she probably would have laughed at Luke too. No. Not Jen. Luke buried his face in his hands and slipped down the ground, sprawled beside the log, without the note to count on. He didn't even have enough of the backbone to sit. Chapter 9. Luke wouldn't have thought he could have fallen asleep there in the woods in danger, boiling mad, but somehow he found himself waking up some time later, stiff and sore and confused. The birds were still singing, a mild breeze ruffled his hair. Before he remembered everything, Luke actually smiled. What a pleasant dream! But why did he feel so unhappy? Then he sat up and opened his eyes, and everything came back to him. The note he believed in so fervently was worthless dust now. No matter how hard he peered off into the underbrush, he couldn't see a single sign of it. He was out in the woods, violating who know how many rules of the Hendrix School for Boys, and he had no idea how long he'd been gone. Squinting at the sun, Luke guessed it was at least mid-afternoon. They must have noticed him missing by now. He should be thinking up his excuse now. He should sneak back so at least they wouldn't find him out here. It wouldn't look so bad. Maybe he could convince them that he'd started to run away. The real Lee Grant had done that, supposedly. And then repeated and turned around. But that story depended on him going back now. Luke didn't move. He didn't want to go back to school. Not now. Not ever. There wasn't anything there for him. He knew that now. No friends, no helpful teachers, no good choices. He was just like some wind-up toy there, marching mindlessly from class to class, meal to meal, trying not to be watched. Just the thought of school made his stomach churn. You can't make me go back, Luke muttered, though he wasn't sure he knew who he thought he was defying. That was settled. So, where else could he go? Home. Luke was overcome with a stronger longing than he'd ever felt before, to see Mother again, to see Dad. This was how miserable Luke felt. He even missed his brothers. He watched a chipmunk race across the ground. The chipmunk's feet barely seemed to touch. It could just be that easy for Luke going home. All he had to do was start walking. But he didn't know how to get there. Even if he had a map, he wouldn't be able to find his parents' farm on it. He didn't have his fake ID card with him. He didn't carry it at school. He could picture it clearly tucked in the pocket at the back of his suitcase. He couldn't go back for it, and getting caught without an ID card was as good as admitting, I'm a third child. Kill me. Luke tried to pretend those weren't obstacles. Still, he couldn't picture a perfect homecoming. Even if he managed to find his family's farm without running into the population police first, he'd be in bring danger with them. The penalties for harboring an illegal child were almost as harsh as the penalty for being an illegal child. Every second he lived with his parents, he'd put their lives in jeopardy, and now there was a record of his existence. If he disappeared now, someone would have to look for him, and when they found him cowering in his family's attic, they'd be sure to find out the truth as well. Luke picked up a pebble and threw it far into the woods. It wasn't fair. His only choices were to be miserable at school or a virtual murderer at a home. He threw another pebble and another. Not fair, not fair, not fair. He ran out of pebbles and switched to bark chips, peeling off the log beside him. Some of the pebbles and bark chips hit tree trunks with satisfying thud. Luke began aiming. Take that! He yelled, forgetting himself. Then, terrified, he clapped his hand over his mouth. How could he be so stupid? He froze, listening so hard his ears began to buzz, but there was no sound of anyone tramping through the woods looking for him. There was no sound from the school at all. Peering around at the ferns and the trees and the sunlight filtering through the branches, Luke could practically convince himself the school didn't exist at all. It was a shame he couldn't just stay here. Luke had a moment of hope. He could live on nuts and berries. He could hide in the trees whenever they came looking for him. But that was a childish plan. He dismissed it immediately. If he stayed in the woods, he'd be caught or starve. He glanced around again, this time regretfully. The trees looked friendlier than any of the boys or teachers at school. He was a farm boy who'd spent most of his life outdoors, until the woods were cut down behind his house. Just being outside was a joy, and no matter how much he risked running out here, it was wonderful to be alone, not packed in and watched at every turn. Luke dug the toe of his fancy Baron shoe into the dirt and stood up. He'd come to a decision without realizing it. He had to go back to school. He owed it to his family and Jen's dad, and maybe even Jen herself. But nothing could stop him from visiting the woods again. Luke put off returning to school as long as possible. His stomach growled, and he ignored it. The angle of the sun's ray grew sharper and sharper, but he consoled himself. It's still daylight. It just starts looking like twilight sooner when you're deep in the woods. Finally, he could ignore the truth no longer. It was getting dark, and even if nobody had noticed his absence so far, he'd be missed at bedtime. Jackalboy would be sure to complain if Luke wasn't there for him to pick on. Strangely, that thought almost made him feel good. Luke didn't stop to figure that one out. He strode to the edge of the wood, looked around carefully, then took off running across the lawn. Halfway to the school, he was struck by a horrible thought. What if the door was locked? A few steps later, he came close enough to tell. The door wasn't open anymore. It wasn't even ajar. Luke dashed even faster across the lawn as if he could outrun his panic. His heart pounded, and it wasn't just from running. He'd been so stupid going out that door in the first place. Or if he'd just stepped outside, why hadn't he gone back right away? Why had he risked everything for a day in the woods? He knew why. Luke was finally close enough to touch the doorknob. He reached out with a trembling hand, prepared for the worst. Stay calm, he told himself. If it's locked, maybe you can find another door that works. Maybe you can still slip back in undetected. Maybe. Luke didn't have much faith in maybes, though. Hopelessly, he twisted the knob. The knob turned easily. Barely daring to believe his luck, Luke pulled the door open a crack. He couldn't see anyone, so he slid in and let the door close behind him. It was dark at this end of the hall. He appreciated the shadows. Luke was tiptoeing past vacant classrooms when he heard a shout. "Hey! What are you doing down here?" It was one of the hall monitors. I got lost, Luke said, not stammering any more than he thought he would under normal circumstances, and the excuse was entirely plausible. He had been lost a million times so far at school. But he didn't know what he was missing. Supper, the evening lecture, lights out. The hall monitor peered at him suspiciously. "Nobody's supposed to be in this wing of the building right now," he said. "Why did you leave the dining hall?" Luke got sudden inspiration. "I got sick. I ran out to go to the bathroom. Then I got lost when I was going back." The hall monitor looked skeptical. "The bathroom's right across from the dining hall," he said. "I wasn't paying attention. I'm new." Sorry. "I was sick." Luke tried to look dumb enough and queasy enough to have made such a stupid mistake. The hall monitor took a step back. He didn't want to catch anything. "Okay," he relented. "Go back immediately." Relieved, Luke turned to go. Then he stopped. Only the day before he would have obeyed unthinkingly, but now he had a secret to protect. Now he had to be crafty. He turned back to the monitor. "I don't know how to get there, remember?" "Oh, for crying out loud, why do I have to babysit all the Leckers?" He took Luke's arm and jerked him to the right. "Go that way, turn left at the first hallway, then right again. Just get out of here." The hall monitor sounded a little panicked himself. The day before, Luke wouldn't have noticed, but now he thought he had to pay attention. Something about that door, Luke thought. Why is the hall monitor so desperate to get me away from it? Luke was still pondering that question when he reached the doors to the dining hall. They burst open and boys streamed out. Luke's timing was perfect. He'd gotten there just as everyone was heading towards the evening lecture. He blended in. "See, Mr. Talbot," he thought bitterly, "I am following the only bit of advice you saw fit to give me. Aren't you so proud? Mighty generous of you, I'm sure." But some of Luke's bitterness had eased. The note had been worthless, but he had been to the woods to think about now. And if the note had led him to the woods, well, he did have a reason to be grateful to Jen's dad, didn't he? Nobody challenged Luke as he walked into the lecture room and sat down. Nobody asked, "Where have you been all day?" Nobody ordered him, "Never leave this building again." He'd gotten away with it. He could get away with it again. Chapter 11. Luke longed to race straight to the woods as soon as he woke up the next morning. It was torture to stand patiently beside all the other boys, splashing water on his face. It was torture to sit still and slowly spoon in the lumpy oatmeal when he longed to gulp it down and get out of there. Though, since he'd missed 2 meals the day before, it was amazing how delicious the oatmeal seemed for once. It was torture waiting for the cafeteria doors to open and release everyone else to class, and Luke to the woods. As soon as breakfast was over, he took off, all but running. Surprisingly, given how confused he had gotten in Hendrick's halls, he managed to make a beeline straight for the door without once making a wrong turn and having to retrace his steps. Approaching the door, he slowed down, waiting for the crowd to clear in the hall. Finally, there was only Luke and a hall monitor several yards away. The door wasn't open today, but Luke was confident it wasn't locked. He was confident he could slip out quick enough. He glanced back. The monitor was looking the other way. "Now!" Luke reached for the doorknob, and then back. At the last minute, it was like something or someone screamed, "No!" in his mind. Mother had talked about God sometimes. Maybe that's who it was. Or maybe it was Jen's spirit, come to help Luke when her father's note hadn't. Maybe it was just Luke's own common sense. Luke didn't know what he thought about God or ghosts or even his own intelligence, but he knew. He couldn't risk going to the woods today. Luke walked on, pretending to be casually dawdling. "Get to class," the monitor growled. Luke nodded and stepped into the next classroom he passed. He felt as disappointed as if he'd discovered bars on the door. What was he, a coward? Luke remembered all the mind games he'd played with himself trying to get the nerve to go to Jen's house that first time. He'd waited weeks, always telling himself he was just waiting for the right moment. He'd been a coward then, but he wasn't being a coward now. Sinking into a seat as anonymously as every other boy in the room, he actually felt brave, clever, crafty. Probably he'd just gotten lucky the day before. If he wanted to be able to go to the woods again and again and again without getting caught, he'd have to be smart about it. He'd have to pay attention to everything. Maybe he'd even have to figure out why the hallmonder the night before had been so panicky before he went again. He'd have to know it's safe. And that's where we'll end for today, and we will pick up tomorrow. Have a great day, guys. Bye.